Hello, it's Aaron, and welcome back to the show. My special guests today are a husband and wife dynamic duo power couple, Tim and Lydia McGrew. They are both philosophers. Tim is a professor at Western Michigan University, and Lydia is an independent scholar who publishes in the analytic philosophy field. They also do a lot of work in apologetics for Christianity. And I actually met Tim recently at a conference. I said, well, why don't I get him on the show? Because we've had some really interesting conversations. I'm not really an expert on apologetics. And so I thought, wow, let's get in and at least get a flavor of this stuff. And yes, they are the parents of Bethel McGrew, which some of you may know and I've had on the show. So, Doctors McGrew, thank you for joining me.
Thank you,
Glad
Aaron.
to be here.
What we talk about today, the topic is the authenticity of the Gospels, which is something you often hear disputed, debated. Did these people really write them? Are the things that are said in them true? Weren't they written like hundreds of years after the fact? Isn't it all made up? That sort of thing. And then there's sort of like the kind of the Dan Brown, I guess you'd say, the whole these are the fakes, and like the real truth is in these other hidden gospels and things like that. So there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theories and a lot of kind of, I guess, real scholarship, if you want to call it that, on the Gospels. But first thing I'd ask is, what do mainstream scholars say about the Gospels and their authenticity?
Okay. Do you want to start that, Lydia, or do you want me to? So there's a couple of different questions entangled here. One of the questions is, what is the evidence regarding the authorship of the Gospels? Do the traditional descriptions of authorship have some body of evidence behind them? Another one has to do with the veracity of the text. Are these reliable reports? Now, those two questions are not wholly independent, because if the authors were people who were close up to the facts, that is part of a case for their reliability. But we can also look at some independent lines of evidence regarding them. The sort of state of mainstream New Testament scholarship right now is to say that maybe with regard to the first and the fourth Gospels, there were communities who in some sense went back to somebody, maybe going back to Matthew, going back to John. And for the other two, who knows? They're just kind of loosey-goosey on that. But it's funny because the reasons for that get bound up with philosophical issues and not just issues of history and text. So, for example, as you read the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three that are often categorized together, you find that they all have passages that refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, if you start with a philosophical bias that says that a foretelling of a future event is never possible, then you have to date these things subsequent to that event. And so that is an assumed position throughout most mainstream scholarship. It's, I think, a very contestable position, but that's the claim. However, there's a bunch of evidence for the trustworthiness of these texts that swings free of authorship. And so there are internal interconnections, there are external evidences. With regard to the third gospel, the Gospel of Luke, that's widely acknowledged to have been written by the same person who wrote the book of Acts, even by people who don't think that it was Luke who wrote the gospel we call Luke. And there's a mountain of external evidence confirming the historical reliability of the book of Acts, because it takes place across such a wide cross section of the geography of the time that there are just many, many, many places to go and look for archaeological confirmation and other kinds of confirmation.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit because that's an interesting one.
Yeah. So I'd like to,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add concerning the state of mainstream scholarship. I think there is a range. There's a spectrum, but if a scholar is considered mainstream, generally he will take it that at least some portions of the Gospels are made up. So that the spectrum would come into, how many portions, right? Much of it, most of it, only a few things, etc. But you almost can't claim to be a mainstream scholar as opposed to, an extreme conservative or whatever, if you don't say, well, at least some of these things are made up. And what's interesting to me there is that you don't even have to be a non-Christian to think that. There are a fair number of people, and I'm not saying this ironically, I think they're really Christians, but who would be like, yeah, because this has just been shown allegedly, in scholarship, we just know that at least some of this is made up, and then we're trying to find out how much, basically. And so I would challenge that assumption, and I don't think it always springs from anti-supernaturalism or an opposition to prophecy. It often springs from just the way that things have gotten baked into New Testament scholarship. For example, that if there's the same story told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and there are small differences, those small differences can't reflect additional witness testimony. They have to reflect something somebody was at least partially making up. And I don't think that's a good assumption. So that's where Tim and I have been kind of iconoclastic, because we're coming in here and we're arguing for a position that's more conservative than even what's taken to be the most conservative scholarly position, but doing so for historical reasons, not because of a diehard theological commitment. So in that sense, we don't really fit into any of the categories.
Some of the criticisms seem to be like a heads I win, tails you lose. So if the Gospels recount the same story slightly differently, it's inconsistent. But if they'd said it exactly the same, you see, that just proves that they compared notes to get their story straight, because no real eyewitnesses would ever have had slight variations in their accounts. I feel like it's one of these things that you can always tell a story to back up what you want.
Right. Well, and a lot of it, I think, is because there's only one kind of dependence that mainstream scholars think of, which is literary dependence. And so a lot of my individually published works in probability theory have had to do with dependence and independence and witness testimony. And something that I've argued is that you can have partial dependence. So you could have Matthew, maybe he's got Mark open for part of the time, he reads it, rolls up the scroll, to refresh his memory or whatever, and writes it. But that doesn't mean that he has nothing that he adds of himself. Even if he's partially literarily dependent, he can still be partially factually distinct. And that's an idea that one doesn't see discussed hardly at all in mainstream scholarship.
You mentioned, you sort of allude that the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels because they're very similar. They sort of tell the same story, and they have many of the same incidents and have much, sort of the same texts. I've got a study Bible that sort of like shows them all, like the different incidents side by side, sort of parallel Gospels. And I always heard like some people say Mark came first, and then there was this Q document full of sayings that Jesus had. And there's other things like that. And this was considered, I guess, to a lot of Christians to be like, no, we can't ever say that. And I don't say, for me, help me understand, is it like a big deal if like Mark was written first and other people were referring to Mark as they were creating their accounts? Like, because I might start with what other people would do. I don't know why.
Right.
What would be nefarious about that?
Well, I mean, that just perfectly fits with what I was just saying a moment ago. There are two different things that one could mean by talking about Mark writing first, or a phrase like Markan priority, which means that one of them is completely sort of neutral as far as factuality. It's like you're saying, it's just he wrote first, and then these other guys used him partially as a source. But very often it folds in these assumptions like, yeah, Mark wrote first, and by golly, if you find Matthew telling that same story, or Matthew and Luke telling that same story, Mark is their only source for what happened, right? And so then automatically any additional thing put in there is made up, right? It's got to be made up if Mark is their only source. So I think we need to split those two things apart, and we need to get the sort of neutral Markian priority, like it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't undermine
Right.
reliability, and distinguish that from the version of Markan priority that does undermine reliability. But scholars themselves are to blame because they often conflate those two.
And then I guess, you say to be mainstream, you have to believe part of it's made up. But is it also the case that they believe some of it's true? Again, this is another one I'm reading, like, oh, people will talk about like the criterion of embarrassment, and they'll say, well, since all four gospels recount that Jesus denied Peter, and that's embarrassing. Peter denied Jesus, and Peter was the leader of the apostles. He would have made sure that didn't get in if it didn't really happen. So that probably really happened. I mean, are there parts that they think really did happen?
Usually. Yeah, go ahead, Tim. You probably have something to say about
again, there is quite a range. And so what we're calling mainstream scholarship here can swing all the way from people who are sort of evangelical adjacent and have considerable sympathy for the idea that there are strands of truthful narrative woven through them, all the way out to pretty far out on the skeptical side of things, who would say there are occasional nuggets of verifiable truth, and it's very largely wreathed around with legend from that small core of truth. So you kind of have to get down to the nuts and the bolts if you want to talk about something in particular. One thing that connects to something that you and Lydia were just discussing is that when there are two passages in the Synoptic Gospels, let's say, to start with, that tell the same story and use some of the same words. First, it's never just a matter of direct copying. It's very rare for there to be even one full sentence that is word for word identical. But there are some places where there's a lot of similarity. Nevertheless, even in those little units, those pericopes, as they are called, sometimes you'll have a unique piece of information that is thrown in. So in the telling of the story of the death of John the Baptist, there's a setup, and you can find that same setup broadly in Matthew and in Mark. But in Matthew, there's an extra phrase put in that's more specific than anything found in Mark. So wherever Matthew's getting this, whether he has independent information or he's making it up, he's not getting it from Mark as we have Mark, because it's not there, nor is it in Luke, and the whole incident isn't recounted in John. So an interesting question that we have then is, suppose that Matthew was familiar with Mark's way of telling the tale. He's started it off and told it in much the same words, but he has some of his own information as well. That is at least a possibility that as a scholar, one has to consider. And then the question becomes, are there reasons for thinking that that unique bit in Matthew actually is truthful and does reflect his possession of other sources? So the questions, again, they intertwine somewhat, but in a fascinating way.
So that's kind of, I guess, if you want to call it the setup. That's kind of the setup for what we're talking about. And I have occasionally seen reference to what, to me, seem like really interesting arguments that show these gospels are authentic. And so I want to go through some of those and get your take on them. Mm-hmm. And then I might ask you a couple of my own favorite questions, if, maybe since I actually have some questions.
Sure.
The one of them is the names. And what I've heard is that basically if you look at the way people are named in the Gospels, Simon and Mary and Jesus, the actual names that are used are in fact the names that would have been given to people in first century Judea when this thing was happening. And not only that, but the actual frequency of the names matches the frequency of the names that were given there as matched on funerary inscriptions. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. Is that true?
It is, especially for the masculine names. We probably don't have, there are cool things to be said about the women's names too. We probably don't have quite a big enough, sample size to get those percentages exactly with the women, but we do have suspicious clumps, like all the women named Mary, which was a super popular name. But for the males, when you take the male names in the Gospels and Acts and compare them to those other inscriptions and so forth, yeah, it's a pretty good match, especially for the sample size that it is. It's very remarkable because those arise, of course, out of the stories themselves, right? I mean, who is Simon of Cyrene? He's the guy that carries Jesus' cross, or who is Simon the leper? He's the guy Jesus has a meal with, and so forth. So it's very hard to think of these being correct, except insofar as they're actually embedded in the stories being told, which does tend to cast some good force in favor of the conclusion that the stories are true.
This is something
Yes.
that, let me just follow up with something Lydia just said. One of the important things is not merely the frequency with which the names come up, but also the consistent use of disambiguating expressions. Simon the Tanner, Simon the Leper, Simon the son of Jonas, Simon Magus. You find that Simon is such a common name that it's almost always affiliated with some other tag. Today, we would use a family name, a surname, in order to disambiguate. But in those times, there was a different method that was used for telling which of these people it was. Even James, James the Less and James the son of Zebedee and things like this. This is a really fascinating feature of the texts, so that when a name that is a high frequency name is used, it's not at all uncommon to have a disambiguator put right in there, whereas you virtually never have a disambiguator put in with regard to a very low frequency name. So that's another mark that these are being written by people who are familiar with the actual names, to people who will expect names that are too common to be disambiguated in that way. So just a lovely touch, and it's easy to miss, who preaches on the fact that Simon is called the leper. Nobody preaches on that. That doesn't seem like it's a very edifying thing. And yet little touches like that have the ring of truth.
I like this one because we can all relate to these internet videos or little memes that show like the frequency of first names just in our society varying so much decade by decade. And you could go down to the cemetery and just look at when were they born, like what was their name, when were they died. You could add them up. And the only way to really fake it successfully, you'd really have to know some modern statistical techniques, which they didn't have. And
Right.
apparently,
Or
like we know, yeah, this is the one I'm defiant because, like, you go to Alexandria, the Jews in Alexandria were called completely different things.
right,
And
Sabbateus is your most common male name
yeah,
down in Alexandria. Like, what is
yeah,
that? That shows up nowhere in the New Testament.
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So
So here's one theory that's been brought forward, and I did a whole video series on this, replying to some of these attempts to refute it. And one theory that's been brought forward is that maybe they used Josephus, because Josephus also has his writings also have this feature. They have accurate name statistics, and he was a first century writer, so that's not surprising. Maybe they just used Josephus and got them from Josephus. But here's a really cool thing that Tim and I discovered. We were reading a novel, we read it aloud, and then I handed this idea to a couple of scholars who went ahead and wrote an article, and they included this in it. There's a novel called The Spear, a religious novel by Louis de Wohl from the 20th century's Catholic author. And he clearly is using Josephus. I mean, he has incidents in the Spear that are not in the Bible. They're from Josephus, and he's trying, right? And he gets these disambiguators completely wrong. He just disambiguates everything. Okay, so he's picked up at some point on the idea that they would often have the son of so and so or whatever, and he just puts those on everything. And his statistics aren't very good either, because he just grabs Old Testament names, and it's not as though all Old Testament names are equally represented in first century Judea either. So comparing the statistics in the Gospels with the statistics in these novels that actually did have the chance to use Josephus, we know that they were using Josephus, is really revealing and tends to refute this alternative explanation.
why you mentioned Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, say first century, and other than a passage about Jesus that he mentions Jesus, and I know some people dispute that, they claim that was a later addition, but it seems like everybody thinks Josephus is authentic. Why is everybody just giving, oh, Josephus is authentic, but these other things, they're just all fake? And like, we seem to have much, much more documentary evidence of the Gospels than we do of Josephus.
I mean, we've got some for each. I think to some extent it's a matter of the percentage of supernatural events. It's considered that the Gospels have too many miracles in them. And for another thing, oddly enough, Josephus is seen as neutral, whereas the Gospels are seen as programmatic. And I don't think that's fair as a comparison, but that is the way it is usually spun. And it's often something Tim and I try to do with skeptics or people with doubts. We're like, look, stop talking about these as the Bible. Just consider them fairly as documents, okay? And if you really thought that you had known this guy and he was the son of God, you'd probably want to write about it too. But stop thinking of them as things that deserve special disfavor because they've been included in the canon of the Bible, and just try to consider them as neutrally as possible, and they stack up very well.
When are the oldest manuscripts we have of the Bible, the oldest surviving manuscripts?
So that's an interesting question. It depends on what you're looking for. If you are looking for relatively complete copies of whole books or of multiple books, then those are going to be later. You'll find maybe some third and fourth century manuscripts that have substantial amounts of material. The trouble is that early on, the way that these things were mostly circulated was in texts that were written on papyrus. And papyrus just is not a long-term storage solution for your data. This is wind and weather, rain and fire are very unkind to papyrus, and the ink in which it was written was often just a soot-based ink. And so this is the kind of stuff that deteriorates unless it's in very special conditions. So if it's in really dry sands, it's maybe been buried in a dump somewhere in Egypt where there's almost no rain, then you might have it surviving for a very long time. But we have fragments that date to the 2nd century, and we can sometimes learn a lot from those fragments, particularly because Christians had a tendency to write down their books and reproduce them, recopy them on both sides of a sheet of papyrus, which gives you fascinating information when you've got just a little fragment like the Rylands P52 fragment, but it's got writing on both sides. You could actually make estimates of how large the page was just from that, because you know what it's supposed to include. You can make estimates of how many pages the book was from the size of the page. So you could actually get quite a bit of information out of that. Still, if you're looking for something like relatively complete copies, then we have Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. These are versions written on both sides of the page that probably date from about the era of Eusebius, when an order was given that the texts be multiplied and sent out. And so those are early, relatively complete copies. Time has made some ravages of this. It's funny when we go to them, we look at them, we discover that ancient people couldn't spell any better than my students can. And so you do have lots of variants, many of the variants very minor. Somebody will spell Herod with the equivalent of one R, and somebody else will spell it with two R's. Well, somebody will say Herod the king, and a different manuscript in the same place will have King Herod. These are not significant differences, and nobody who is sane bats an eye over them. But counting those kinds of things up is often a way of making the number of textual variants seem so vast, seem like we must just have a hopeless task to reconstruct the text. Whereas for over 98% of the text, there's really little to no doubt whatsoever about what was originally written. But the manuscripts, fragments go back into the 2nd century, and relatively complete ones you can have from very early 4th century forward.
And I think you're talking there about New Testament, right, Tim?
Just the
Yeah,
Gospels, yeah.
Yeah.
right.
Okay,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, I know the Dead Sea Scrolls have some stuff from like even earlier.
Sure.
You can find some stuff.
Yeah.
One of the things, Tim, that you were telling me when we met was the interesting cross connections between the Gospels, particularly between John and the Synoptics. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Sure. So it turns out that there's a kind of interlocking that you can find among the texts in cases where neither text is really copying the other. And yet, some little detail will come up in passing, perhaps in one of the Gospels, that will explain something that was a question left over from your reading of the other one. There are a lot of these, and they crisscross the text in all directions. They occur in stories that recount miracles. They occur in stories that don't recount miracles. The synoptics explain things in John. John explains things in the synoptics. The synoptics explain things in one another. So it's really quite a robust form of evidence. This is called the argument from undesigned coincidences, places where nobody sat down deliberately to say, hey, there was that loose end left over in John. Let me see if I can fill it in for him. And the better you understand how to read, the more clear it'll be to you that these are not people who are trying to manufacture this. So I'll give you one example. In John chapter 6, we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And that's a story that occurs in all four Gospels, but it's told with somewhat different sets of details in each of the Gospels. And the details interlock in fascinating ways. So right at the outset, Jesus turns to one of his disciples and says, hey, where are we going to find enough food for this many people? This is in John 6, verse 5. And I often present this to an audience and I say, so suppose we're making this story up. Which disciple would you pick to write into the fictional story? And they sort of stare at me, and then somebody says Matthew because we're talking about, money and buying food. Some of them say Judas because he held the purse. Some of them say Peter because Peter's all over the gospel. So who would know, right? And then you actually look at the text and it's Philip. And you stop and you try to say, what do I know about Philip from the Gospels? And the answer is, for someone who's one of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, not a whole lot, right? He's close to being a non-entity in the Gospels. Why would you pick him if you were making the story up? Well, go back over to Luke chapter 9, which also tells this story. It says nothing about Philip, but it does say that they were in a region belonging to or nearby Bethsaida. So you get a location. Still, that doesn't answer the question. Go back to the Gospel of John, but now go forward to chapter 12. And in verse 21, some Greeks come, they want to see Jesus. And so they come to Philip, and it just says in passing, who was from Bethsaida. And when you put all three of these together, you're like, okay, Jesus in John 6 is saying, so Philip, you're from around here. How are we going to do this, right? Was the local supermarket up to letting us get food for this many people? He's talking to Philip because Philip's actually from around there. And it makes sense of it. Now you understand why he would turn to Philip rather than turning to Judas or Thaddeus or whatever. So I like those little interconnections. And the point is not just that there's this one of them. If there were only one, you could say, well, that's curious. That could just be a coincidence. But again, there are scores of these crisscrossing the narratives in every direction. So that's just one where a detail in Luke helps us to understand something that happens in John. But similarly, when we read the story in the Gospel of Mark, Mark says that Jesus told them to sit down on the green grass. That's not in Matthew. That's not in Luke. It's Mark only. And going back over to John, John tells us what time of year it was, because he says in verse 4, John 6:4, now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was at hand. And the Passover is a spring festival. So it's right in the middle of the growing season, and the grass would be green then. It just little interconnections like that. And exploring these is really a lifelong business. I don't think anyone has yet discovered the last undesigned coincidences. We have a lot of them, but the hunt goes on, and they're really quite fascinating.
Another one I find interesting, and you alluded to this earlier, is all of the things that Luke gets right in the book of Acts. So Acts isn't a gospel, but as you say, everybody agrees he wrote the book of Luke too. And there's actually, there's actually even a whole Wikipedia page on this because it's so solid. What did Luke get right about the Roman world in Acts?
What did he get wrong?
Pick
Yeah.
me. No. I was I was doing a deep dive into one of these the other day. I've known about it for years. I want to promote a book here, not one of my own books. It's called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. It's by Colin Hemer. And if you go to archive.org and do a sufficient amount of searching, you can find a free copy to read online for free. Well worth getting. And so here's a geographical one that's so cool. There's an island called Cauda. It was sometimes called Clauda, sometimes called Gaudos, but similar names. And it's off the coast of Crete. In the ship voyage passage in Acts, where Paul is a prisoner but he's appealed to Caesar and he's being taken to Rome. They sail south along the south coast of the island of Crete, and they temporarily they get blown off course by a northeast big storm, and they temporarily end up right underneath, they call it under the lee of the island of Cauda. And that fits perfectly because Acts has mentioned where along the coast of Crete they were before, where they're trying to go to along the coast of Crete, what direction the storm comes from, etc. And you put all that together and it makes sense that they would end up, and you look on a map, we have a map, we have Cauda on the map, and there it is, and that's where you could very plausibly end up. But you go to Pliny the Elder's natural history, and he gets wrong where Cauda was located. He says it's next to Crissus, and we know where Crissus is too, and where that is, and what that is closest to on the coast of Crete, right. And it's the wrong place. So, in other words, people who say, well, the author could have just gone and looked this stuff up. Well, first of all, that was way harder back then. You didn't have like reference works or things like that, but
couldn't go to Google Maps.
You couldn't go to Google Maps. You couldn't go to Wikipedia. But Pliny the Elder would actually be, if you had access to it, a plausible place to even try to do that. Right. And if Luke had gotten it from Pliny, he would have gotten it wrong. But in fact, he got it right. I just love that one.
Yeah, there are tons of others.
Every geographic location correct, and all the titles of every official and all the places where they go, and so had kind of encyclopedic knowledge of
of the places where he'd been, which you could easily pick up if you actually went there, right? But not living in an information age, much harder to gather, to the point that some more skeptical scholars have suggested that Luke actually had a travel document from somebody who actually had been to these places, and he hadn't, and that he incorporated the travel document into what he was doing, which is completely ad hoc, theory. How convenient, that he just happened to have this, and that he just pretended to have traveled to those places. That's like an extra epicycle to add instead of his just traveling to those places as a companion of Paul. So, like you said, the titles, the politarchs of Thessalonica, that they were dragged before when there was a riot in Thessalonica, and that we have an inscription that shows that that's actually what the city council of Thessalonica was called. It's like a specific term. So it's so cool, and if nothing else, it shows, I think, undeniably that the author was a companion of Paul, and that, of course, would give him access to a lot of material.
Funny thing to add to that, there's an older author who is praised in Colin Hemer's book. This is James Smith, who was a yachtsman. He was a British yachtsman in the 19th century, and he actually went and spent a year over in the Mediterranean and sailed over the entire route, spoke with sailors out on the Mediterranean Sea, and did a meticulous analysis of the text. He had a vast knowledge of ancient Roman ships and practices, and he says this section that begins in Acts chapter 16 and then with a break goes through and is picked up again of the voyage and ultimate shipwreck. This was written, he says, by an eyewitness, and the person who wrote it was not a sailor. And then he proceeds to argue in great detail for this. And it's absolutely absorbing stuff. I wish we could recover now, and we're trying to help this to happen, some of these older works that deal with the historical reliability of these texts, because there's just gold sitting there. And if you read it, take, for example, the bit when they finally arrive, probably at Malta, and they're afraid that the ship's going to be wrecked. They throw the anchors off the stern of the ship. You read that as you're going through Acts and you say, okay, fine, whatever. That's not where the anchors are normally located. That's an emergency procedure. Normally they're located near the bow of the ship and you put them off the front. Why would you throw them off the back? Well, if you were afraid that you were so close to a rocky shoreline that simply the length of the ship swinging around, rotating around the bow so that the stern came in closer, could smash it against the rocks, then you would throw the anchors off the stern out of fear of that rotation in wild seas. And so it makes perfect sense. But Luke never bothers to stop and explain why it's done. He just says that it was done.
He probably doesn't know why.
That's Smith's point, is that he probably doesn't know why, but he faithfully reports what he can, which is they threw them off the stern. It makes great sense if you're a sailor and you know what you're worried about. Otherwise, it's just, well, that's what they did and you don't understand it. So it's a wonderful book. There's so many other things like that. Get us starting and we will give you a very, very long list of things to read. So.
Yeah. Lydia, we were corresponding before this podcast, and you sent over an interesting one I want to ask you about. You said that the Gospels contain patterns of details, especially unexplained and apparently pointless details that don't fit with either ancient or modern fiction, but do fit with what we observe from ordinary oral storytelling about things that really happened. What are you referring to here?
Right. So I say the gospel details are in the Goldilocks zone, just right. Not too hot, not too cold, right? In ancient fiction, there was ancient fiction. They were incredibly purple. And what I mean by that is that it's like, oh, woe is me, and they'll tell these big parades. Almost any ancient novel will have a parade with everything described, the magnificence of the parade being described, very over the top. Modern novelists, of course, know that that's tacky. And so modern novelists will be very realistic, but they'll be consistently realistic. If you start off a breakfast scene and they're going to tell you the breakfast scene, then you're going to get what everybody did, and this guy lit a cigarette and then he put it down and so on. It's going to carry through that breakfast scene. The Gospels are neither of those. You don't get those purple prose passages. You don't get those overwhelming things like you have in ancient fiction. But at the same time, the distribution of details tends to be random. So, for example, in the story in John 21, it's a resurrection scene. So, it assumes that a miracle has happened, and also tells about Jesus causing them to have this great catch of fish. But there's this totally random detail all of a sudden in there where they recognize it's Jesus on the shore, and Peter puts his coat on before he jumps in. And that's just kind of weird. Like, you would be more likely to take your coat off before you jump in. To swim, it's going to get in your way, And it's just because he was stripped for work. But even so, I'm sure they had all seen one another stripped at some point or other. These guys have been walking around with each other for over 3 years, sleeping under hedges, So for whatever reason, right? It doesn't tell you why, but he just puts it on and he dives in. And then they see a charcoal fire. So we get that little detail. It's a charcoal fire. And then it just goes, and after breakfast, Jesus said, and you're like, whoa. I wanted to hear everything they said during breakfast. No modern novelist would have those little details about the charcoal fire and the putting the coat on, and then leave out, he'd give you the whole conversation. So it's lovely, because if you talk to someone, if you get someone to tell you stories of his life, he will do that. You'll get a little point put in there, and you don't know what it means, but it just happened to pop into his head. He'll be leaving stuff out that you'd like him to explain. He'll be explaining stuff that you'd like him to leave out, whatever. But so that it has that feeling, that texture of memoir, I believe, rather than either kind of fiction. You're mute.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. My son's going a little crazy out there, so I'm like muting a little bit while I was going. But so you're saying that like John wrote his own recounting in this style, not that the author is writing down what somebody told him.
Well, I think John is in some sense the author, and I think a very robust sense. Now, they sometimes had a secretary who would write something down, but I think this is more or less the way John told the story. And that he remembered that Peter put his coat on, right? And somehow that makes it in there, even though it doesn't really contribute anything to the story, right? I mean, there's nothing. I suppose if I got imaginative, I could think of some far-fetched theological thing about Peter putting his coat on, but why do that, right? It's like a mark of. It's like a mark of witness testimony, like that. Or I'll give you another one in John 3. It says that the disciples of John the Baptist were having a dispute with somebody else. It just calls him a Jew. And it says about purification. So they come to John the Baptist and they complain about Jesus' popularity. They say, that man that you testified to by the Jordan, he's baptizing and everybody else is coming in. So they're kind of annoyed that Jesus is more popular than their own leader, John the Baptist. And then John the Baptist goes into this whole thing about how he's lesser than Jesus, Jesus is greater than him, etc. Very famous passage, concluding he must increase and I must decrease. What got left out? The dispute, right? I mean, like, what was the dispute? Why were they asking John the Baptist about it? And how does his answer address the dispute? Never explained. It's just dropped. And again, as I say, that kind of an unexplained detail and pointless detail is, I think, a mark of someone who's actually been there, who remembers, this got kicked off in this way, but because that's not really where he's ultimately going with the story he wants to tell you, it gets dropped as he moves on. And I think it's a great mark of witness testimony.
You can see this in contemporary memoirs as people are telling the stories of their lives, whether it's your old neighbor who was a World War II vet, or recorded videos of recounts of the life of Jimmy Fortune or somebody like that in the music industry. You get these things. The bit that I mentioned before about John chapter 12, the Greeks come, they say, "Sir, we would see Jesus." They ask Philip about it. You never do find out what they wanted to ask Jesus about. That just disappears. That's that kicked this scene off, and then on it goes. And you get to the thing that really matters, which is what Jesus is about to say, and you're sort of setting up for the Last Supper. So this is, again, just a mark of the way that people typically recount stories. And I think that a loss of historical know-how and loss of an understanding of how real people tell their real stories lies behind some of this hyperfixation on trying to come up with some heavy spiritual interpretation of every detail. So in John 21, how many fish were there? 153. Oh, well, what's the significance of the number 153? They go into all these elaborate things. Well, is it a triangular number, or was it some other person's listing of all the fish, all the types of fish, including shellfish that there were? We try to come up with a number that's sort of close to 153. It just makes me want to say, have you ever known any fishermen? Do they tell you how many fish they caught? Do they tell you how long they were and how much they weighed, and tell all their friends until they don't have friends anymore? Yes, of course, fishermen obsess over these things. That's just the way it is. Of course they counted the fish.
And they had to take the fish out of the net in order to ever use the net again. So it's a perfect opportunity to count the fish, right? And you can picture them. They're throwing the fish out, 141, 142, and I think a lot of these were young men, if I can throw that in. And I think that helps to explain some of it too. If men in their teens or their 20s, I mean, I think they had a great time counting the fish, really. I think it all kind of fits together.
Well, we could talk about a lot more. I mean, I know you could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours, and there's massive numbers of videos out there online about this, but I don't want to go too long. I just want to give people a flavor for this. Before we go, I want you to tout your own books this time. If there's anything, a book or two that you guys have done, I know you've done a bunch, that you think would be particularly interesting, and then I'll drop a link to buy them in the show notes.
Testimonies to the Truth. That's my most recent one. We're working on getting it into audiobook form. That may take a while, but it is available on Kindle, and it's real accessible. So let's put that one out there. And Hidden in Plain View was about those undesigned coincidences that we were talking about. And then maybe I'll mention a third one, The Eye of the Beholder. That's just about John. If you really want to do a deep dive on John, that's all. That one's thicker. It's all about John. So I'll mention those three. And by the way, Hidden in Plain View, I wrote it, but Tim first told me about the argument from Undesigned Coincidences. I would not have known about it if it weren't for Tim. And then we agreed together that whichever one of us, instead of trying to co-write it, whichever one of us got the chance first would write the book. And the next summer I wrote the book. So that's how it came about that I'm the author of that one.
No, that's quite all right there. We don't need to argue about the distribution of credit. That'll give us some authenticity to our conversation here.
There we go.
What could be more true to life in a sense? You think about like all the little things that just the way that we talk about, and you give a transcript. Was this a real conversation or did someone make it up? I think there's more than enough to show that this was like a real conversation with real people. So the same things happened with the gospel too. So my guests today, Tim and Lydia McGrew, thank you both for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron,
so
for
happy
having
you
us.
had us.